The prairie wind howled that night, carrying with it the lonely cries of coyotes and the heavy scent of rain-soaked earth. Inside a weathered cabin, nestled against the foot of the hills, a single woman sat by her dim lantern, knitting silence into the long hours. She had lived alone for so many years that the creak of the timbers and the sigh of the wind had become her only companions. The world outside was wild, merciless, and filled with dangers both seen and unseen. Yet within those four wooden walls she had carved out her fragile island of survival. The storm rolled in with fury, lashing against the roof and rattling the shutters. Thunder cracked across the plains like cannon fire. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, stoking the fire to fight back the chill. Nights like this made her remember how it felt to be small and powerless under the endless western sky, how it felt to lose everyone she'd once loved. The years of loneliness pressed harder than the storm, whispering their cruel reminders. And then it came, a knock, not the casual rap of a neighbor passing through, not the hesitant scratch of a lost traveler. This was deep, steady, deliberate, 3 heavy thuds against the wood. Her heart stopped cold. She froze, listening, every muscle tight with dread. No one came here. Not at this hour. Not in this weather. Whoever stood at her door was no accident. She crept toward the entrance, lantern trembling in her hand, and slowly lifted the latch. When she pulled the door open, the lantern's glow spilled out into the storm and revealed a sight she would never forget. A giant Apache warrior stood before her, rainwater streaming down his broad shoulders, his dark eyes watchful yet strangely calm. Beside him leaned an old man, frail and shivering, wrapped in a thin blanket that did little to shield him from the night. The younger one spoke, his voice deep but humble, carrying the weight of desperation and dignity all at once. "Can we stay? Just one night?" The storm raged on around them, but inside her chest an even greater storm began to rise. Who were they? Why here? And what would happen if she let them in? Life on the frontier was never gentle. Out here, the land itself demanded everything from those who dared to settle it. Sweat, blood, and often, even the people they loved most. The plains stretched wide and merciless, where a single tree or a crooked fence post might stand as the only landmark for miles. Every dawn brought new labor. Every night brought a new kind of fear. Wolves howled from the hills, rattlesnakes coiled in the dry grass, and storms could sweep across the land with the fury of a war band. Her cabin had been built with her own hands, plank by plank after fate had stripped her of everything. Years ago, she'd come west with her husband and 2 small children, carrying dreams of land and freedom. But dreams didn't keep crops alive, and they didn't stop the fever that came one long winter. Within a single cruel season, she buried her husband behind the cottonwoods, and her little ones followed not long after. Since then, the homestead had been hers alone, her refuge, her prison, her battlefield. She had grown hard in that loneliness. A woman had to, if she wanted to survive. She learned to cut wood, to hunt rabbits with a steady hand, to patch her own roof and mend her own clothes. But no amount of work filled the silence that crept in each night. She would often sit by the fire staring into the flames, remembering the laughter that used to echo within those walls. And now, on this storm-torn night, strangers had appeared at her door, strangers she'd been raised to fear. The word Apache carried with it 1,000 tales whispered through townsfolk, stories of raids, of scalps taken, of homesteads burned. Her heart told her to bolt the door and keep them out. But as she looked at the shivering old man leaning on his son's arm, something inside her stirred, something buried deep, a memory of compassion, of what it felt like to care for another soul. It was dangerous, she knew. Letting them in could cost her everything, but denying them might mean their death. The door shut against the storm with a dull thud, but the tension that followed was sharper than any wind outside. The small cabin suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in as 3 souls shared the flickering light of the fire. She kept her lantern close, setting it on the table, though her hands trembled as she did. Her eyes flicked from the towering warrior to the frail old man he supported. The giant Apache stood like a sentinel, unmoving, his broad frame filling the room with quiet power. His wet hair hung in strands, his chest rose and fell with steady breaths, but he said nothing more. His silence was as heavy as the storm's roar. Every tale she had ever heard came crawling back to her now, Stories of raids, of families cut down without mercy, of women taken from their homes in the night. Her neighbors had whispered these things around campfires, their voices full of fear and anger. And here in her cabin was the embodiment of every one of those warnings. Yet the old man was no raider. He collapsed into a chair near the hearth, his body shivering, his cough rattling deep in his chest. The sound was weak, pitiful even, like a dying branch breaking in the wind. She instinctively reached for the kettle, filling a tin cup with hot water, but stopped short, her hand hovering. Did she dare offer kindness? What if it was a trick, sympathy bait for betrayal? Her mind warred with itself. The instincts of survival screamed caution, told her to keep her distance, to demand they leave as soon as the rain let up. But another part of her, the part buried beneath years of solitude, saw not enemies but men battered by the same land that had battered her. The Apache's dark eyes caught hers then. He held her gaze steady and unreadable. She could not tell if his look carried threat or gratitude. The silence between them was louder than any words. Was she sheltering danger? Or was she about to find the one thing she had not known in years? An unexpected bond, born of necessity. The fire cracked softly, casting restless shadows along the rough-hewn walls. The woman sat in her chair, her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes fixed on the strangers she had let in. The storm outside had softened into steady rain, but inside, another storm was beginning to change course. The old Apache shifted forward, his frail hands trembling as he held them toward the warmth. His cough rattled again, deep and raw, but after a long silence his voice came, low, rough, yet steady with memory. Through broken English and the quiet patience of his son filling in the gaps, he began to tell his story. He spoke of a time when their people roamed freely across the plains, following the herds, moving with the seasons. He spoke of rivers that ran full, of children's laughter echoing through the canyons. But his words soon turned to sorrow. Soldiers had come, settlers too, driving them from their homes. Promises were made and broken, land taken, families starved. His voice caught as he recalled the hunger winters, when even the strongest warriors grew thin, and when mothers wept over children too weak to rise. The woman listened, her arms folded tight, yet her heart tugged in ways she hadn't expected. Loss was something she understood all too well. Though their stories were different, the pain was the same. The cruel hand of fate stripping away those they loved, leaving only the emptiness behind. The giant warrior, silent until now, reached into a small leather pouch and placed something gently on the table, a beaded charm, worn and simple. He slid it across the rough wood toward her. His eyes met hers, and in that gesture there was no threat, only trust. A bridge offered where before there had only been walls. She sat frozen, staring at the token. The distance between them felt smaller now. Enemies, perhaps once? But here, in the glow of the fire, they were simply people, survivors bound by grief, sitting in the same fragile shelter against a world that showed mercy to no one. The fire's warmth had just begun to soften the edges of fear when the sound of horses broke through the night. Hooves pounded against the wet earth, muffled but unmistakable. The woman's breath caught in her throat. She glanced at the Apache warrior, whose head had already lifted, ears trained like a wolf catching the scent of danger. Moments later came the voices, rough, slurred with whiskey, carried by the wind. Shadows moved outside, circling the cabin. She knew that kind of voice. Not neighbors, not travelers, outlaws, men who lived off fear and plunder, scavengers who crept through storms to take what they pleased. A heavy fist slammed against the door. "Open up!" a voice barked. "We know you're in there. Storm's no place for decent men to be sleeping outside." Laughter followed, harsh and cruel. The woman's knees weakened. She'd heard of this gang before, drifters with nothing to lose, who left behind only ashes when they passed through. Alone, she would have had no chance. But she wasn't alone. Not tonight. The old man coughed, gripping the arm of the chair while his son moved silently to the door. The Apache warrior drew a knife from his belt, its blade catching the firelight. His dark eyes turned to her, steady, asking without words if she was ready to trust him. She gave the smallest nod. The door burst inward. 3 men stumbled inside, rifles glinting, their boots dripping mud across her floor. The stench of sweat and whiskey filled the cabin. "Well, well," one sneered, eyeing the woman. "Didn't think we'd find such hospitality out here." Before he could take another step, the giant Apache struck. He moved with the sudden power of a storm, slamming the outlaw against the wall so hard the boards shook. Another raised his gun, but the woman, acting on instinct, snatched the kettle from the fire and hurled its scalding water into his face. His scream pierced the night. Chaos erupted. Steel clashed, fists flew, the cabin became a battleground. Through it all, the warrior stood between her and the danger, fighting not as her enemy, but as her protector. His strength, once a shadow that filled her with dread, now stood as the only thing keeping death at bay. The storm outside raged on, but it was nothing compared to the battle within those four walls. When the last outlaw stumbled into the storm, clutching his bleeding arm and cursing into the rain, silence finally returned to the cabin. The door hung crooked on its hinges, the table was overturned, and the floor bore the scars of the struggle. Smoke from the fire mixed with a copper tang of blood. The battle was over, but it had left its mark. The giant Apache leaned against the wall, chest heaving, a shallow cut across his brow leaking crimson down his cheek. His knife was still in his hand, but his shoulders sagged. His strength poured out into the fight. The woman's heart thudded as she realized how close death had come, how easily the cabin might have been her grave had it not been for him. The old father coughed violently, his frail body trembling after the strain of fear. Without hesitation, she knelt at his side, steadying him with gentle hands. She fetched a cloth and dipped it in water, pressing it to his forehead, just as she once had for her own children when fever stole their breath. Her walls of suspicion, so carefully built over years, had cracked. These were not enemies. They were men, flesh and blood, fighting the same merciless world she was. The warrior watched her tend to his father, his dark eyes softening. For the first time since he entered her home, he spoke more than a few words. "You saved him," he said simply, voice heavy with sincerity. She shook her head, wiping the old man's brow. "No, tonight we saved each other." A fragile bond had been forged in the fire of survival. Where once she saw a threat, now she saw a shield. Where once he saw a stranger, now he saw a refuge. They had stood together when the storm came knocking, and in doing so, had become more than the sum of their broken pasts. Trust had taken root in the ashes of fear, and for the first time in years, the woman felt she was no longer alone on the frontier. The storm outside had quieted to a whisper, a gentle patter against the roof instead of the fury it had been hours before. Inside the cabin, the fire glowed low, its embers crackling like the heartbeat of a story that had not yet finished. The woman sat near the hearth, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, the old Apache resting in the chair beside her, the giant warrior standing silently at the door, keeping watch over them all. And it is here, friends, that I must ask you a question. If it had been you in that lonely cabin, staring into the eyes of strangers who carried with them the weight of an old fear, what would you have done? Would you have bolted the door, turned them away into the storm, and told yourself it was safer not to risk compassion? Or would you have seen in them what the woman eventually saw, souls battered by the same harsh world, no different from your own? The frontier was a place of hard choices, where every knock at the door might mean salvation or destruction. But it was also a place where hearts could still surprise you, where an act of trust could change the course of a life. So I leave it with you. Picture that storm, that knock, that moment of decision. Would you see enemies at your door? Or would you see human beings just as lost, just as wounded, just as in need of mercy as you? Sometimes the story isn't only about the people inside the tale. Sometimes it's about the choices we imagine for ourselves. And so the night faded into dawn, the first pale light spilling across the horizon, turning the wet earth into a canvas of gold and silver. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered, in the broken door, in the weary faces, and in the fragile bond now forged between three strangers who had begun the night divided by fear, but ended it united by trust. The woman stood at the threshold of her cabin, looking out at the wide-open plains, her heart no longer as heavy as it had been the day before. She realized something she had long forgotten. Survival on the frontier was never just about a rifle at your side, or the strength to split wood. It was about something far deeper, about compassion, about the courage to see humanity, even when history and fear told you not to. The Apache warrior had proven that strength could protect, not only destroy. His frail father had shown that even in weakness there was dignity. And the woman herself had learned that opening her door did not mean surrender. It meant discovering that kindness, even in the harshest land, could build a bridge no storm could wash away. The Wild West was a land of dust, blood, and unforgiving trials. Yet sometimes its truest stories weren't about gunfights or gold, but about hearts choosing mercy when hate was easier. Because in the end, the hardest frontier was not the land itself. It was the frontier of the human heart.